podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wynn. Welcome to How We're the podcast from Roker Report. And because we felt like spoiling you a bit more during this international break with another pod, I have a couple of people with me who are itching to talk about where things currently stand with the lads ahead of what is likely to be a pretty strange run-in. So first, we have a familiar voice who always has something to say on this pod. It is, of course, Gavin Henderson. Hello, Gav.
Hey, mate, are you calling me a gobshite? Are you just being polite?
Of course I am, yes. I'll send it to your face many times. How's it going, mate?
I'm very good. Sun's shining, can't complain. Sunderland haven't spoiled me week yet because they can't, because they're not playing. So,
well, that's it. I was going to say, are you enjoying the break?
Strangely, yes. I know you've said a few times recently, haven't you, on here that you generally hate international breaks. But I think we can all agree that this one was probably needed. We all could have done with a break from Sunderland, particularly after the events of this weekend, not just our game but elsewhere. So, yes, I've got to admit I've been enjoying it, not having football on my mind as much. But then I say that I'm sat here talking about football, so I'm a glutton for punishment, aren't I?
But it's different when you're not speaking about current stuff, because last weekend just made us want to forget about football completely.
Yeah. But we won't go into it. I don't think anybody needs to talk about what happened at the weekend.
That's it. I've hinted at it, and then we'll leave it there. But we need someone else to help us kind of put our current position into context. And we have probably the ultimate authority when it comes to the history of Sunderland AFC. Many of you might be like me, where I have a shelf devoted to his books on the lads, which always makes an appearance on my desk while I'm writing, usually the on this day pieces for Roker Report. It is, of course, Rob Mason. Hello, Rob.
Hello. Welcome to you and to everybody listening. Thanks for asking me to take part.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've always got your books out, Rob. Looking through them, but I was just wondering, when we're kind of looking through them and we're kind of getting second sources and things like this, how many times do you get people kind of send you a message going, "Oh, I've noticed this stat, and I didn't get 49 goals, I got 50 goals or something."
Yeah, a bit, not much. I think the biggest one I got was, I can't remember which book it was, but I'd said Colin Bell was born in Cold Heselden. And the number of people who told me Colin Bell was not born in Cold Heselden, but Heselden, which apparently is a different bit of Heselden. It was one of those, if you had £1 for every time you were told, you could have bought a new car sort of thing. That was probably the one I was picked up on the most. I'm very lucky in that whenever I write a book, I've got 3 or 4 people who are real Sunderland experts, some of whom have co-authored books with me, and let's name check them. So Mike Gibson, Barry Jackson, Niall McSweeney, and Andrew Smithson are my brains.
Andrew, who of course writes for us.
Yeah, Andrew, who of course writes for you. He's an absolutely brilliant lad. As are those other 3 people I just mentioned. They've all got their own specialisms, but whenever I'm writing anything, I run it by those guys. They're very kindly, Andrew and Mike in particular, very kindly, thoroughly proofread everything, as well as the other guys, chipping in with their specialist information and knowledge. So anything I ever put into print has been sieved through, if you like, by a few Sunderland experts. And in fact, I remember writing in the acknowledgements to a book a year or 2 ago that with Mike and Andrew in particular, I feel like a centre-half who's got both Jimmy Montgomery and Johnny Mapson behind them, tipping my mistakes over the bar. And so I'm very, very grateful to those people. So yes, nobody's perfect. Of course, everybody can make a mistake, me included. The day somebody doesn't make a mistake, it's the day they're dreaming that they're perfect, which nobody is. But every effort's made to make sure every fact and stat is correct. And I do rely on those 4 guys a lot to work with me, and a lot of the information I have is provided by those guys in the first place. Some of them are absolutely stats gurus. I mean, if I'm an anorak, these guys have got an anorak with a parka on top, and they're both fully zipped up. So I am lucky, and I've got a team of real experts who help me, and who I'm always extremely grateful to.
Well, I'm glad you name checked Andrew Smithson because,
great lad. Can't speak too highly of Andrew, and his pieces he writes for you are absolutely superb.
Yeah, they are. And because on a personal level, Andrew was a massive help to me when I was putting the SAFC 365 together, which was the Roker Report book that went out for the Soup Kitchen a year or two ago. It feels that much longer, but he was fantastic. So actually, just on that, Rob, what have you got anything in the pipeline? Because I think the last release was, in terms of Sunderland, was What If? Which covered
no. After I did What If last year, I brought out a book called Sunderland AFC, the definitive record.
Oh yes, of course.
I have to say that was not my title. I didn't like that title at all. But I didn't have a better one, and that was the title the publisher wanted. But that was a history of the club, which started off with my wife, who gets all the best trips, of course. I took her up to Ayr to find a recently demolished street called Green Street, where James Allen, the founder of the club, was born.
Wow.
So I started on the day that James Allen was born back in 1857, and then worked the way right through the history of the club, all the highs, all the lows of the club. And that took us up to the last game of last season, the Sheffield Wednesday game at the end of last year. This year, there's a paperback version of that coming out in the summer, which I have to say, when I learned that a couple of months ago, was a surprise to me. I didn't know. But that will be the same book, just paperback, unless we win promotion. If we win promotion, which, of course, if we do, is going to come through the playoffs now. If we win promotion, I will have precisely 4 days to write a new chapter on the season that we're now in, culminating in what we hope is a promotion. And then there'll be that extra chapter in the book. If we don't win promotion, it'll be the same book as last year, just in paperback. So that's on the go. But yes, the What If book you mentioned was, I think, the year earlier. And I have to say that was a book that I particularly enjoyed writing. It was a bit different to my stock in trade of dealing with history. And it was the alternative history. It was all the sliding doors moments of, what might have happened in the club's history, depending on, who we did sign, who we didn't sign, whether bribes had been accepted, etc. If Coventry had kicked off on time in 1977, the Mr. Smith scandal of the 1957, etc., etc.
Yeah. And I was going to say, actually, when you went up to where James Allen was born, you should have taken your own little blue plaque and stuck it somewhere. The founder of Sunderland AFC.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, speaking of blue plaques, as you may well know, about 10 or 15 years ago, I was actually responsible for making sure the blue plaques went up on the sites of all of Sunderland's former grounds.
Yeah.
And, very pleased about that. And incidentally as well, when we played Sheff Wed recently on a Friday night, I was a student in Sheffield in the 70s. So I went down for that game and I stayed with an old college friend of mine. And she's not interested in football at all. But to her credit, she'd said she'd been seeing what was on in Sheffield that might interest me that weekend. And she said, Rob, there's this talk on the Saturday morning. And I went on a guided walking tour with 3 real experts of the early history of football in Sheffield. And if people know their football history, they'll know that before Sheffield Wednesday or before Sheffield United, what's believed to be the oldest club in the country, even older than Notts County, is Sheffield FC. And so I was taken on a walking tour with about 15 other people around the various buildings that the initial meetings of Sheffield FC had been held in. And we looked at in detail at, something I've looked at before, but it was interesting to hear from the Sheffield point of view, looking at how the rules of the game were formulated in Sheffield and were at the same time as a separate set of rules were being formulated in London, and looked at how those rules eventually were combined and saw how much of the game's history actually depends on what came out of the Sheffield set of rules. So that was real football historian anorak stuff, I admit, but fascinating nonetheless.
Well, that's it. Well, the Northern rules are always going to be better, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's just the way it is, isn't it? It's funny because I was going to mention on the blue plaques thing quite a few years back. Me and my brother used the blue plaques of the old grounds for a pub crawl.
A lot of people do. A lot of people do, and it's very popular. I think sometimes people organise little minibus tours around them. And a couple of times I've sort of led a guided tour. And we've made a point of popping into one or two of the pubs as part of the route of that, and we've advertised that in in advance, not necessarily saying it's a pub crawl, but just giving people a little bit of a break, because not everybody who wants to go on such a tour is interested in the beer. Some are, but for some it's just going in and being able to use the loos or have a cup of coffee or something. But it's a popular afternoon out. If you can spend a good 2 or 3 hours touring around the sites of all of Sunderland's former grounds, and I don't know if they've still got any, but at the time I did the blue plaques, the council produced a little 8-page pamphlet with a guide as to where they all were and a little map and a little bit of history. I wrote all the text, but the council put it together, and it's that spawned a lot of pub crawls, shall we say?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say I spent a lot longer than 2 or 3 hours on going around them, but that's another story for another day, I think. But of course, you're now moving into the punditry side of things and the TV side. We see you kind of regularly on with Frankie and Danny in the build-up to games and during game.
Do you know, all the years I've been writing the programme, which is way back since 1986, I consistently kept my picture out of it. My picture was never in the programme. If we ever won a Programme of the Year award, I'd get all the contributors together, take their photograph and keep myself out of it, because I like my anonymity. And although I've done stuff on the radio for many, many, many years and people sometimes recognise me because of my voice, it's only this season that I've been doing the bit with Frankie and Danny on the club stream before the game. So, of course, my cover is blown now, so I get recognised a lot more, which is nice, don't get me wrong, but I think I probably always had a face for radio and was better on the radio than on the telly. But, yeah, Frankie and Danny, I know not everybody appreciates Frankie. I think he does an absolutely first-rate job. Let me put that on record. And I think what people don't realise is that while Frankie's commentating, he's got people in his ear telling them this, telling them that, telling them the other. And he organises everything brilliantly. He handles it all brilliantly. He gets a lot more in his ear than Nick Barnes does because, I do a bit with Nick Barnes beforehand, and I know how much Nick gets fed to him through the headphones. And it can be very off-putting, as you guys will know, if you're trying to talk while simultaneously somebody's in your headphones telling you something completely different. Frankie does all that. I think he does all that brilliantly. And I honestly think this is not me just sucking up to people because they're my friends. I honestly think Danny Collins is an absolutely first-rate pundit. And one of the reasons I say that is they make it clear when you're listening to them for away games, Frankie and Danny are not actually at the match. They're watching the game back from the Stadium of Light. And so they're reliant on the pictures that everybody else is seeing. And when there's a substitution, especially if the cameraman hasn't been good enough to actually show who's gone off and who's come on, for either team, not just Sunderland, Danny will very quickly work out who's come off, who's gone on, and what tweaks there has been to the formation. And he's very, very informative. I think he's absolutely excellent.
Yeah, but always kind of rely when you're listening to Danny Collins. He always spots. I mean, the example that springs to mind. He always spots things on set pieces. He always spots where somebody's doing a routine or someone's been, kind of bumped out the way and how they've done it. He always tends to spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you listen to me, you're just getting some fan's point of view. Really, if you listen to Danny, you're getting a real expert's point of view. Somebody who's played the game recently and knows exactly what's going on. He sees things that I think the average fan, including me, doesn't. Yeah. And so I learn a lot when I listen to Danny.
So I assume that's a regular thing then, Rob? We'll see more of you on there.
Yeah, pretty much I do every game with Frankie and Danny. I mean, for decades, absolutely decades, I was at every Sunderland away game, including any pre-season friendlies they might have in different countries. I think I've seen Sunderland in 14 different countries and 154 different grounds in my life. So for years I was up and down the motorways going to every game. But these days I only get to the occasional away game. If I'm at an away game, then I don't do Frankie and Danny. But if I'm just watching it, because normally what I do is I go into the Stadium of Light for an away game. This is I do my bit with Frankie and Danny on the build up to the game, and then I sit and watch the game in the sports bar. And usually, because Frankie and Danny disappear off into another little room where the acoustics are better for the actual commentary. Mm-hmm. And unless it's a game where they're having a beanbag and fans are in, most of the away games, I'm then sat in the sports bar by myself, and I've got the big giant screen in the sports bar and the adjacent giant screen with all the other results rolling in. And I sit and watch the games in the sports bar on the big screen.
It sounds like a really hard life, Rob.
And then go home either really happy or in a right huff if we've got beat.
That's it. Well, it'd be good to see you. It's always interesting kind of seeing you on there. And just quickly, I mean, talking about some of the history before we get kind of into the current playing staff, I just kind of wanted to mention the passing of Don Kitchenbrand, who was South African centre forward who played for Sunderland in the late 1960s.
Late 50s. Late 50s,
sorry.
Don Kitchenbrand, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Don Kitchenbrand was before my time. I mean, I started going, first games I saw at Sunderland were late in 66 and they were Youth Cup games. And the first team game I saw was February 67, an FA Cup fourth round tie where we beat Peterborough. You've got to bear in mind I was 8. We beat Peterborough 7-1. We're 4-0 up in 27 minutes. And I thought it was like that every week. And then I waited 20 years to see Sunderland score 7 goals again. And then they did it twice in 3 weeks. Sunderland beat Sunderland. So Don Kitchenbrand, who played in the late 50s, was before my time. But I knew about him. You know, my mum and dad, who were regulars in the 50s, would tell me about Don Kitchenbrand, known as the Rhino. And he was a South African player, and having come and played in Britain, you know, he was a Catholic player who'd played for Rangers. He played very successfully for Rangers. He'd once scored 5 goals for Rangers at Queen of the South, which was a club about 45 miles away from where I lived when I lived in southwest Scotland. You know, a very, very successful player, but he left Rangers to come to Sunderland. He actually signed for Sunderland the day after I was born in March 58. He signed for Sunderland the day after I was born. And so when I was born, Sunderland had never, ever been relegated. As you know, they were the only club never to have been relegated. And of course, I came along, and 2 months after I was born, they got relegated. My brother was born in 64, the promotion season. It likes to remind me that, you know, they went up when he was born and went down when I was born. But on the day Sunderland were relegated, they won 2-0 at Portsmouth and hoped that would be enough to keep them up. Don Kitchenbrand scored the 2 goals that he hoped would keep Sunderland up, but then results elsewhere went against them and they ended up going down. So that was basically Don Kitchenbrand at Sunderland. But about three years ago, I think it was, I tracked him down to the old people's home he was living in South Africa. And I made a call to the old people's home and said, you know, how was he and would he be up for an interview? And arranged an interview. And I interviewed him a few days later. And when I did interview him on the phone about 3 years ago, he was absolutely brilliant. Had great memories of playing for Sunderland, great memories of playing for Rangers. And if you read the obituary, of people have read the obituary I wrote on the club's safc.com website last week, I quoted a bit of that because he talked about his love of rhinos, given he was known as the Rhino. And he said, you know, rhinos, if they take off, they just don't stop going. They barge everything out the way. He says, that's the way I played. And then he wanted to end the interview, and I included this in the obituary, where he was saying, you know, he'd not been to Sunderland since 1982, but he was always looking out for the result. He always loved Sunderland. He always wished the team well. He always wanted to see them winning. And it just struck me, and strikes me still, that he was like most of the players I ever interview. Not all of them, but most of the old players I ever interview, whether they're from Sunderland or whether they're from outside the area, or in the case of Don Kitchenbrand, from a place as far away as South Africa, if they get the club stays with them for the rest of their lives, just like it does for all of us as supporters. And so, you know, he had real red and white blood running through those veins, and a sad loss as it is whenever we lose a former player, but a really terrific character and a really terrific player from his era in the late 1950s.
Yeah, but it was sad news when that came through. And just in terms of the historical stuff, Rob, because I'm seeing my lad grow up and he's kind of 11, 12 years old now.
Yeah.
I'm going to sound like a proper old bugger here when I get onto this, but it doesn't seem like there is necessarily the enthusiasm to learn about the history of the club. Because when I was young, I wanted to know everything because I had first-hand stories from my dad about the likes of Shackleton, the likes of Montgomery.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that really exists anymore. Because
well, that's an interesting point.
And I was going to ask you just before that, you know, do you feel a bit of responsibility in terms of almost being that person who keeps putting that information out there?
Well,
that's a very good question. Firstly, I would hope that 11-year-olds have got better things to do than think about the history of the football club. Maybe they're interested. They're interested. Yeah, they're interested in the football club. I would hope is about the current team, and that interest in the history might occur when people get a bit older. But also a fact you've just made me think of is when you're saying, your elder relatives were talking about great players like Jimmy Montgomery and Glenn Shackleton. I suppose now if you've got an 11-year-old daughter or an 11-year-old son, and you're talking to them about the football that you saw, if you're a parent, the kind of age you would be, if your son or daughter is 11, you've maybe not got so many really great players that you saw growing up as people in the past. Although, of course, the first names that come to mind are Kevin Phillips and Niall Quinn and people like Kevin Ball. So we have had some, relatively modern-day heroes. But it's the same when I put together a Hall of Fame dinner at the football club. We normally induct sort of 10, 8, 9, 10 people at a Hall of Fame dinner. And I try and strike a balance between true greats from maybe 100 or more than 100 years ago that we induct. And if we do that, I've always tracked down a modern day descendant, a direct descendant of that person to come and accept the award. But we also like to have 2 or 3 or maybe 4 real life people who are still alive, who can walk on that stage and accept the award themselves. And in order to do that, those people, I cannot dilute the caliber of the person who's inducted into the Hall of Fame. So they've really got to be somebody who stands comparison with the Shaqs and the Rach Carters and the Charlie Buchans, who were already members of the Hall of Fame. And it's harder to find the modern people. It's easy to find a modern day player, but it's harder to find a modern day player whose record stands comparison with the early greats of the football club. And that leads me on to what you're saying. Do I feel a responsibility to sort of make people aware of the history of the football club? Well, I don't feel a responsibility. Maybe a duty is a better word as the club historian, to make people aware that, what a great and truly special football club they do support, if they support Sunderland. But let's just say when I'm at the match, when I hear the fans chanting 6 league titles and still going strong, that's got to be my favourite chant, because 3 of those titles were in the 1890s. 5 of them were before the First World War, and all of them were before the Second World War. But even if you're 11 and you join in with that chant, 6 league titles and still going strong, that shows to me you do appreciate the club. It does have a strong history, even if you can't actually relay much of it in detail in a conversation. And yes, the historical books that I've written, and I write about 10 or 11 pages still in the match programme every week, and most of those are historical series. That's my way, as best as I can, of sort of making people aware that Sunderland does have a history as rich as any other club.
Yeah, and I mean, Gav, just to bring you in on the conversation, because obviously running Roker Report as you do, we do the on this day pieces, as I mentioned before. We do one every day. We've done more of that for the last 4 years or something like that, maybe even longer. Can't even remember when we started that up. I think that was Martin who started that up. But then we did the SAFC 365, which kind of put some of the more obscure ones in a book, as well as some of the kind of more well-known ones. I mean, how do you feel that, that you put that on the website alongside obviously all the current news and, how we're doing and match previews and things like that? Do you think it's important to keep that out there?
I do, because I think you talk about future generations and everything's online now. So if it's out there, it's out there. And a lot of these stories haven't been written up, or if they have, probably not in the way that we've done it. So I think, you can probably, you're talking about 4 years, it might have even been longer. We've been covering this off every day for that period now. So that's the vast majority of the big moments in the club's history that we've now documented. And it's not just a case of, ripping off other people's stuff from other books. A lot of this is really well-researched stuff from newspapers. I mean, we have access to newspaper archives. So, it's important stuff, because I kind of think otherwise a lot of it wouldn't be out there. Or if it was classed as being out there, you've got to really go looking for it. So now it's out there, it's online. You can search the name of any of the people involved in those particular cases, and the stories are out there, and they will be there for us, hopefully for as long as the internet exists. Which I think it's kind of it's doing a job that maybe isn't particularly done elsewhere. So I think it's only a good thing. And you know, when you look at the as Rob said brilliantly there, the club's history is vast, and there's so much that you can go into. And I mean, probably you'd even concede, Rob, you know, you probably haven't even scratched the surface with everything you've written about. I mean, if you really dig deep into all the stories and you talk to people who've been involved around the club, and journalists and kit men and people behind the scenes and board members, going all the way back to the club's history, you know, we probably haven't really scratched the surface fully.
There's always more.
Yeah, exactly.
And yes, I mean, you just talk there about talking to kit men or something. Well, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've been out just socially, you know, for coffees or whatever, with 3 or 4 ex-directors of the club, 2 or 3 old secretaries of the club. Secretaries always have great information. Not all of which, you know, if I chat to somebody, I chat a lot to people off the record, and a lot of times, you know, I might have learned things that I wouldn't necessarily put into the public domain because, you know, they're private or they're told in confidence, but nonetheless, it still gives you an insight and background information as to why certain things happened at certain times in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, like I said, we're on to our 5th round almost. But let's say I'm pretty sure it's our 5th year of doing it. But because we've obviously covered all the big games from each day on each year, that now we're having to dive into the newspaper archives. But actually, like Gav kind of touched on there, some of it's gold. You know, it's obscure stories like Sunderland, you know, fans getting on a train and, you know, being praised by, you know, other clubs and things like that because, you know, they're well behaved or they helped someone or something like that. And it's bizarre, the stories you get. But
absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, you wouldn't be surprised to hear me say this, but all football programs are also a great source because I mean, sometimes people ask me the most obscure things. I won't bore you with the details, but sometimes it means I sit with a cup of tea and I'll just pull out a particular season's programs, trying to find out something. Like, I'll give you one example of a random thing somebody asked me in the last week or two. Somebody was desperate to know when the Black Cat Club opened. Now, I don't mean the Black Cats bar at the Stadium of Light. They mean the Black Cats Club at Roker Park. They wanted to know when did that open. So I thought, well, the only way I'm going to find that is, I guess it was around about 66, when Roker Park was started up in, you know, ahead of the 66 World Cup, you know, 65, 66 sort of time. So I just delved through that particular season's programs to start to find references to when the Black Cats Club at Roker Park actually opened. And of course, when you do that, you've got to be really disciplined looking for what you are looking for that particular needle in the haystack you're looking for, because you're very easily distracted by thinking, oh, really? And you find out 20 other things you weren't looking for simply because you browsed through a season's old programs. And that would be true of any club, not just Sunderland, of course.
Yeah.
I like looking at all of the old adverts, you know, from when you look at the old programs, and even in the newspapers, actually in the archives.
Yeah.
It's like an advert for bins and things. You end up just totally veering off in a completely
absolutely no. I mean, there's the social history of the town starts to come out when you start looking at the adverts. You know, you look at the old beers, or, you know, that were advertised, or the old places that were advertised, or the things that were advertising. It's a whole of the world. You can lose yourself in it, but quite easily. And so, as I say, if you're researching something, you've really got to put your blinkers on and say, no, I'm just looking for this. But if you've got time to just browse, you can go off on a you know, an endless number of tangents.
Yeah. And that Black Cats bar, that was Régis bar in the end, wasn't it? When it all came down?
Sorry, the Black Cats bar?
Did it end up as Régis bar in the end?
No. I don't think so. Maybe it did. I can't remember. I just remember it was the Black Cats bar upstairs at Roker Park. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, let's get back to the modern day. And I want to kind of, for a bit of context, Rob, I want to take us kind of back to the summer, because obviously we appointed Frenchman Régis Bris, only the 4th non-British or Irish manager by my reckoning. Because I certainly knew nothing.
Depends on whether you include Terry Butcher, born in Singapore.
Yeah.
But obviously 77 England caps.
Yeah. I was going to say, after that Sweden game when he had his bandage on, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
You can say he wasn't.
Yeah.
But to me at the time, I didn't know anything about him. And it felt like a huge gamble in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, did it feel that way to you? And obviously, what do you think of the job he's ended up doing?
Obviously, when Régis Bris came in, I, for one, had never heard of him. And after the long gap we'd had without a manager or head coach, I was thinking, well, who are we going to appoint? But when Régis Bris was appointed, like everybody else, I was scrambling around trying to say, well, who's this guy? I had actually met him a couple of days before he was appointed because I'd been asked in the close season, I'd been asked to go into the football club and give a talk to all of the academy coaching staff. And I'd been asked to do that because Stuart English, who's the head of coaching, said, Rob, we've got a lot of coaches. Some of them are Sunderland supporters, some of them are not. But even the Sunderland supporters don't know an awful lot about the history of the club. And it would be good for them to appreciate the background of the club they're working for. So will you come in and give them a talk? So I said, yeah, no problem. Went in, gave them a talk. And I'd literally just started when at the back of the room, in walked Kristjaan Speakman and Régis Bris. Kristjaan had heard I was giving this talk. Kristjaan's heard me giving me spiel before, and had brought Régis along to listen. So Régis sat in. This was a day or two, if I remember rightly, before he was officially announced. And then after I'd given me talk for however long that was, when the coaching staff then moved on, they were there for the whole evening. They were going to be having a number of talks about what they were going to be doing in terms of their approach to coaching this season. So I left all of them in, and I had the pleasure of chatting to Régis and Kristjaan for about 15, 20 minutes just in the corridor before, I made my way home. I was still living in Scotland at that time. And before they went off to do whatever they were doing. And then a day or two later, Régis was announced as our new head coach. So at that point, I'd had the chance to at least meet him and have a little bit of a chat to him. But again, I was scrambling around trying to find out much about his background. Clearly, he got off to an absolutely brilliant start. We set a number of records at the beginning of the season, which I'm sure you discussed at the time, in terms of, winning games at the start of the season, winning games without conceding a goal. Even, I think, up to about the 13th game of the season, our record still stood comparison with just about any time of the club's history. So he got that brilliant base. I remember after 4 games, Régis came along I interviewed him on stage for the Senior Supporters Association, where they have an audience of about 200, 250. And as Régis came in, I was waiting for him and meeting him in the corridor before I took him into the main sort of Monty suite where we do the interviews. And Dick Malone was there. And I introduced Dick Malone to him, and I said to Régis, this is Dick Malone, one of our famous team from the 1973 Cup winners. And Dick, who's a great guy, as I'm sure you know, Dick just said to him, he says, Régis, he says, you can go in there and you can say whatever you like. Nobody can criticise you. Played 4, won 4. You can do no wrong. And although people at the moment, as we speak now, which is between the Coventry and Millwall games, as everybody's, flat because we had that poor result and very poor performance at Coventry. Heaviest away defeat since the 6-0 at Bolton that saw the end of Lee Johnson back in January 2022. And of course, that followed on from the rather disappointing game against Preston North End. People are feeling a bit flat. But here we are, the middle of March. We're 4th off top. We're a country mile ahead of the team 5th off top. And while there's a little bit of disappointment, we've dropped out of the possible race for automatic promotion. If we'd been having this conversation before the first game of the season away to Cardiff City, and we'd said by the middle of March we'll be 4th with a double-figure gap between us and the team 5th. If I'd said that now, everybody listening would have been said, well, we know Rob's always the glass half full man. He's always optimistic, but he's lost the plot this time. What's he been drinking? Yeah. So we've done brilliantly. Yes, we've had some disappointing results and some disappointing performances, but you've got to look at the big picture. And come the end of the season, we may well still get promoted. Actually, I had a little look at this, and after 38 games, which is where we are now, we're fourth. But when we won the league under Peter Reid, who you just mentioned, in 1995-96, I'm not talking about 105 points season 99.
Yeah.
In the 1995-96 season, after 38 games, we only had 3 more points than we've got now, but that put us top of the table on 72 points after 38 games. This year we've got 69 points after 38 games, and when we qualified for the playoffs a couple of years ago under Tony Mowbray, 69 points was the number of points we had at the end of the season to qualify for the playoffs. That was our final total, 69 points. We've got 69 points now, and it's still March. I think you've got to say to Régis Bris, well done. That's absolutely brilliant. Is he perfect? No, of course he's not. Nobody's perfect, me included. But you've got to say, if anybody wouldn't have been happy at the beginning of the season, then you're going to meet somebody. If somebody had not been happy with that, if they told us that was going to be the situation before a ball had been kicked, then that would have been an impossible to please person. Because having finished 16th last year, to be 4th now with those figures I've just given, I think you've got to take your hat off to him and say, yes, so far he's done a good job. But finally, just to wrap that up, as always in football, it's what happens next that's most important. And can he now finish the job? Well, time will tell.
Yeah. And just, speaking of people whose glass half full, Gav, just to bring you in on it, building on what Rob says, it is easy to forget that we appointed a manager, never managed in England, never mind the Championship. And in terms of kind of, adding players to the squad, I was looking and there's only kind of Isidore and Mepham, I think, who's played more than 15 games, league games, who wasn't around last season. And then he lost Jack Clark after a couple of games. So he's done this with almost the same squad that was struggling in the second half of last season.
I think he's done an amazing job. And to be honest, it really ticks me off when I see people laying into him when they won't look at the bigger picture. Yes, he's made mistakes, as Rob said. I think at times we could have been more adventurous this season. But at the same time, I look at the way we play and I think, well, that's what's got us this far. You bang on to mention last season because it is largely the same group. And the style of football last season, it lent itself to the results we then got because it was laborious. We were trying to play on the front foot. We were moving the ball around, but we weren't able to cut teams open. This season, what we found is with a style of play where we sit off a little bit more, we use the pace and the athleticism in the team, and we can hurt teams. Yes, we don't dominate games, but we can hurt teams, and really that's what's got us this far. If you look at the whole span of the season, we've won a lot of football games because the style of football has got the most out of these players. And that comes from the coaching. And it's not just Régis Bris, that's everybody who's around him in the club. But mainly he's the man at the very top of the tree when it comes to that side of things, and he's the one leading it. And I get annoyed because I think, well, I would have, as Rob said, I would have snapped your arm off for this position. And all I'm worried about is his task now is to get us motivated for 8 games where we really don't have a lot to play for. And that can be difficult when you're playing against teams who are fighting and clawing for things. You've got teams who are fighting and clawing for relegation to stay out of the bottom 3. You've got teams who are trying their best to break into the top 6 and do what we did under Tony Mowbray and get in there at the last minute. So we've got to try and find a way forward where we are still trending upwards, but at a time where, and we're in a very strange position, Rob, and I've said this before, I can't remember another team, not just Sunderland, but another team who with, even 10 games to go, you were looking at it and going, we're in the playoffs. I can't ever remember a time where that's been the case, where you're looking at the top 2, you're out of that race, but you're also looking at it and going, there's no way you're going to drop out of that top 6. It's a very fortunate position we're in, but at the same time, it makes his job interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a good point, Gav. It's a conversation I've had with a number of people over the last week or two, in that now we are meandering towards the end of the season. And I think the Coventry performance was one that I'd feared from a team who are now settled in 4th place. We're not going to finish in the top 2. Barring disaster, we're not going to drop out the top 6. And subconsciously, though nobody would ever want to do this, subconsciously, I think that the jeopardy has gone out of the games. And I thought the only player who was anywhere near his regular standard at Coventry was Luke and I thought everybody else, without exception, had an off day. It was just to what extent they had an off day. And if we are going to struggle like that till the end of the season because we haven't, as you say, got the motivation of anything to play for, the difficulty, of course, is when the playoffs do come around, you can't just turn your form on and off like a tap and suddenly switch on again. And coming back to what you said at the beginning about, is this a good time for a break? I think it is a good time for a break because it gives everybody a bit of a chance to reset, to recharge the batteries. Of course, some of the players that we want to put their feet up and have a bit of a rest aren't getting one because they're away playing 2 or 3 games on international duty. But nonetheless, mentally, they're all getting a break from being away from Sunderland. And those that are not on international duty are hopefully getting a complete break, I presume with just some light training or relatively light training going on in the meantime. But when we come back to action against Millwall, and of course the return of Alex Neil, when we come up against Millwall, we've got to come out and look for a reaction because the points don't really matter to us at this stage of the season, but the performance does. We've got to go in there and put on a display that makes everybody around the club, be it the staff, be it the players, be it the supporters, come away from the Millwall game thinking, yeah, we're still at it. We're still one of the best teams in the league, as opposed to the very poor team that turned up at Coventry. And I have to say that my counterpart at Coventry, as their club historian, Jim Brown, emailed me after the game to say how disappointed he was in Sunderland. But equally, he said to me, however, that was without a shadow of a doubt Coventry's best performance of the season. So we also caught them on what was a good day for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because Nick Barnes mentioned something similar to what you've both been talking about, where he feels, being around the place and speaking to people, that there's almost a mental fatigue within the squad, within maybe some of the younger players with the schedule. We've been playing twice a week for quite some time, especially kind of around the festive season. But I mean, do you think that is something that's impacting us? Because from my point of view, I think when you're winning, when you're on a run and you're winning games, mental fatigue doesn't come into it, and neither does physical fatigue. If players are carrying knocks, if you're winning games, suddenly they disappear. But if you're not winning games, those knocks pop up and they might not want to play, or they come off injured or whatever. So we were talking about, over the last couple of weeks, this balance he's got between trying to keep players fit, but at the same time trying to get that momentum with your best side, that you almost start feeling invincible and you almost feel like you're going to win the game before you get on the pitch.
Yeah, I think, if it was me, which, fortunately for everybody it isn't, if it was me, I would now, with, to go 8 games, I would now be taking several of the players out of the side for 3 or 4 games. And I'd be playing the likes of Alexic, for instance, who sat on the bench week in, week out and rarely got a look in. Give him 3 or 4 games, say go and show what you can do, with a view to then bringing back your first choice players in the last 3 or 4 games, having had that bit of a breather. I'm not saying completely, they might get 30 minutes here or 20 minutes there or what in the meantime. But then taking them out of the firing line, giving them a bit of a break, but bringing them back with 3 or 4 games to go, with the aim of then being right up to speed, fully at it when the playoffs come around.
I mean, Gav, would you be that drastic?
I think in some cases possibly, yeah. It depends who it is, though, who we're talking about. I think that you look at what he's done in the last couple of weeks. He's certainly, to some degree, dropped players out who would ordinarily be in his best team. I think Isidore's had to take a break. He's probably the most glaring example of that. Otherwise, you look around the team and he's a bit hamstrung because we're still missing him 1 or 2. But there are other examples where you think, Alan Brown has barely played 400 odd games at this level.
Yeah.
To me, it blows me mind that he's not really getting more of a look in now that he's fit. But it's certainly an opportunity to get him in. Rob mentioned Alexic. There's a player who I've actually enjoyed watching. I think he looks pretty decent. We haven't seen a great deal of him, but what we have seen, he's all right, and he's missed a few chances, but looks a good young player, looks athletic, very quick, deceptively quick, actually. Leo Hjelde going to get a chance, whether he likes it or not, because Dennis Serkin's injured, and we don't know how bad that is. Jensen Seelt looked good when he came on against Coventry, I thought. One of the rare glimmers of light out of that game for us. So there are players there who we can bring in. And I think it's going to be really interesting kind of viewing how he handles this. Certainly the first few games after the break. Because I've mentioned this on the pod a couple of times already recently, but it was interesting to me that when the manager spoke to the press, particularly when he spoke to Nick Barnes in the press conference before Coventry, he was focusing a lot on what happened after the international break. There was obviously a little bit of talk about Coventry, but he was being asked, about the playoffs and all the rest of it, and he was already looking ahead, kind of past the Coventry game, which I don't know whether that was a wise move or not. But it tells me that there is some sort of plan for dealing with what's to come. And whether that is what you suggest, Rob, whether that's dropping players out who maybe need a rest or not, I don't know. But I definitely think, because of what I said before, we're in a very fortunate position. I think we've got to try and maximise this as an opportunity rather than looking at it and saying, well, we've just got 8 games to go now. No, we've got to look at almost like a mini pre-season. Like, do we have to look at this and say, we've got a real opportunity here to rotate properly. Let's not push it too much. But also, the other side of that is, of course, if the results are going badly, then you come under an immense amount of scrutiny for why you're dropping players who would ordinarily play. So
yeah, you can't win. I mean, if you're absolutely right. If he brings in Alan Brown, Lexic, and one or two others, and the results fall off, and let's face it, we're not guaranteed the playoffs yet. That gap we've got could disappear if we just lost every game. But yes, if he did that and the results were bad, he'd get slaughtered. But equally, if he keeps playing the same players, and then they are completely shattered by the time the playoffs come around, everybody will turn around and say, why didn't you rotate when there was 8 games to go? So whatever you do, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't as a football manager or a football head coach. Everybody always knows better than you. Ultimately, it's your decisions and your ideas that you've got to stand or fall by. And while I've got my opinion and Gav and everybody else, as in the crowd, has got their opinions, ultimately it's down to Régis Bris. And I think Régis Bris's opinions so far overall have proved to be very successful, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Robert, it's funny because I was thinking when you mentioned that promotion under Peter Reid, 95, 96, because actually I think if I remember rightly, we hardly scored any goals that season in terms of for being. I think we were really low goal scorers, because I remember Shea Given broke all sorts of records for clean sheets that season. But I was just looking for this season. I mean, in terms of goals, it's really strange because there's only been 6 out of the 19 wins this season have been by 2 clear goals. And I was looking at, even though it's only Leeds, Borough, and Norwich have scored more goals than us, I was looking at our top scorers, and you've got Isidore on 12, Mayenda on 7, but then after that, Mundle on 5, Rigg and Bellingham on 4, with Rigg and Bellingham playing well over 30 games this season. Then you've got Dan Neil and Patrick Roberts on 2 goals, and they've played 38 and 37 games. And even though we're overall one of the biggest scorers, I mean, from looking at those numbers, you should really expect some of those players to chip in a bit more. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a point I've been making from midfielders in particular. I think when Chris Mepham scored, I can't remember exactly, I think he might have been the 18th different scorer we had this season. It's not a record. It's a little bit behind the record for number of different scorers we've had. But certainly the point is the goals have been shared around the club, shared around the squad. And apart from Isidore and his 12 goals, obviously Mayenda's got, as you say, has got 7. 3 of them haven't come very, very recently. And Mundle's 5th goal came in the last home game. So, you're into March and your second top scorer was on 4 goals, really. Sorry, let's get that right. I think Mundle, Mayenda got his 2 at Sheffield Wednesday on the last day of February, didn't he? Which took his tally to 6, and 4 of which had come against Sheffield Wednesday. 2 at home and 2 away. But yeah, the point is, as I say, from midfield players in particular, I mean, Bellingham, I think, is an excellent player. Rigg's an excellent player. they do get into the box a fair bit, and I'm absolutely sure those lads are looking and thinking we should probably have more than 4 goals to our name. Dan Neil, okay, I mean he scored. I can't remember which game it was. You'll probably remember where he scored that absolute stunner from about 30 yards, and in his position, and it was one of the goals of the season. But in his position, he's not likely to get that many goals. But I still think maybe more than 2. I think Dan's an excellent player. I often sit back and think he's possibly our best player. But he needs to add more goals to his game, accepting that in the role he's played for most of the season doesn't put him in a position to score many. He's more or less the quarterback, isn't he? Even on corners, he's the last man left back on the halfway line to play forward a good attacking ball if it's half cleared. And speaking of corners, I'm certainly in the camp of those that would like to see us leave a man or 2 men up when we're defending corners.
Yeah, I think I've got away to Swansea. That Neil,
that sounds about right, which is a long time ago, but yes, he whacked one in from outside the box, didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, Gav, where do you stand on that issue? Because it's a bit of a contradiction to say that we're the league's 4th top scorers, but we can have a whinge about how we're getting them and who's getting them.
Well, obviously it's the biggest gripe of almost every fan who watches Patrick Roberts, isn't it? That you see a player who, for me, has some of the best individual talent I've ever seen from a Sunderland player, and that I genuinely mean that. I think when you see the way he can carry the ball and the regularity at which he puts the ball through people's legs and nutmegs them, for somebody to be able to do all of that but not stick the ball in the back of the net is just so frustrating. And I think that's one of the big gripes that a lot of people have with him as a player. But you could go right through the team. I think the one thing that sticks in my mind constantly is, and I might just be remembering my childhood completely wrong here, but I'm fairly certain that when I was a kid, midfielders were just more all-rounders and they scored more goals. And like a central midfield player, I think of like an Alex Rea or a Gavin McCann or Stefan Schwartz or players like that, where I think they chipped in with a bit of everything. That could tackle, that could pass, that could take it around people, that could get you an assist, but they'd also score a lot more goals than the midfielders do today. I don't know whether I'm just remembering things wrong or not. But
I don't remember Gav and Stefan scoring an awful lot of goals, but you are talking about higher caliber players. I mean, Stefan was obviously top draw, one of the best players I've seen at Sunderland since we moved to the Stadium of Light, and one of the best guys as well, for that matter. Gavin as well, of course, got into Sven-Göran Eriksson's first ever England side, against Spain at Aston Villa, and again was a top level player. I know Alex Rea played a lot in the Championship. Now, he was a midfielder who, of course, would score a lot of goals, be in the Championship and still looked a threat when he was playing in the Premier League, and possibly the best goal scoring midfielder in, I say recent years. It's not that recent. In the Stadium of Light era, I would say is probably when we had Don Hutchinson, who was always likely to get into the box and get you a goal. But yeah, midfielders, you can't rely on Wilson Isidore to score every chance he gets, and he has missed some. And I think what I've said about Wilson, who I really, really, really like, by the way, so far he's shown himself to be a scorer of great goals rather than a great goal scorer. I think if you lads did a highlights reel of every goal he scored, lots of them would be really, really class goals. But we need somebody with the Gary Rowell touch of just popping up to pop the half chance in the 6-yard box. And that's what we haven't had. We haven't had a poacher. How many times have you seen it where somebody puts the ball across the 6-yard box and everybody's saying, where is anybody to tap it in? We haven't had that sort of fox in the box kind of person to take up the unspectacular goals, but the tap-ins that end up meaning you've got 15 or 20 goals in a season. If Wilson Isidore had been able to get a few of those, as well as the spectacular goals he scored, then I think we might be fighting off teams in the top half of the Premier League who want to pay big money for him.
Do you not think that's a modern day problem though? Because if you look right through now, there's not many traditional tap-in centre forward. The one strikers who get involved in build-up play and
that's right, yeah,
pull wide and play like another midfielder. There's just not many of them about these days. Josh Madger is probably the only one I can think of off the top of my head in the Championship.
It's a wider discussion, and of course, a lot of teams will play with just one lone striker, and the tap-in merchants are often the man who plays off the big striker. Think Kevin Phillips, for instance. I'm not putting Gary Rowell in that category because, as Gary always likes to point out, he played most of his games as a midfield player, despite the fact he scored a lot of goals. Gary was the as well as being the best penalty taker I've ever seen Sunderland have in my lifetime, Gary was the master of the person who drifted into the box late and was Johnny on the spot for the little tap in, be it a header or a side-footed shot from inside the 6-yard box. You look at a highlights reel of Gary's goals, and he's one of only 3 people since the war to score over 100 goals for Sunderland. But most of Gary's goals were not spectacular ones. There was the odd spectacular one. I remember a particular volley against Stoke at the Fulham end, for instance, that was a great goal. But most of his goals were the goals that you don't particularly remember. But he was the man who actually was the Johnny on the spot, and that's what we really need. But so does every other team, of course.
I'll throw Lee Clark in there as a goal scorer midfielder as well.
Absolutely.
He got a few.
Maybe it's just my sort of whimsical youth or whatever, but I remember just midfielders were definitely better in front of goal than they are these days. Frank Lampard did it year on year. Chelsea, didn't he?
Not all of them. Not all of them. If you think, here we are this month, we're commemorating. There was a do-on the other night that Jeff Brown hosted at the Peacock, looking back to Sunderland when they got to the Milk Cup final in 1985. And of course, that midfield included Steve Chuck Berry and Peter Daniel, who rarely got in the box, let alone scored a goal. So, yes, we had some midfielders in the past who scored a lot of goals, but it's a bit like looking back at the charts and thinking, I remember all these great records from the youth. And if you look at the rest of them that were out at the same time, it was just as much rubbish then as there is now.
Yeah. I mean, just in terms of how we got to where we are, Rob, I'm interested to hear your views on kind of how the club are doing things, because the last few years for me have felt like probably the first time where that the club have a plan. And even though I think that's a good thing, I know a lot of people have found it frustrating, and it can be frustrating. That we talked to Kieran Maguire the other day about club finances, and he was saying, the football fan just wants, it's all romantic. You want to just go out and buy that player and buy that striker. So, but how are you seeing the way that we're doing things, especially with our focus on younger players?
Well, the focus shifted. Again, when Mike Dodds was in charge for a long time at the end of last season, I mentioned earlier interviewing Régis Bris on stage for the Senior Supporters Association. During Mike's long spell as caretaker head coach, towards the end of last season, again, I interviewed him at length for an hour and a half or so on stage for the senior supporters. And at that point, that very question you've just raised was made to Mike about the fact we had such a young team. And Mike did say then that the decision had already been taken in the club from discussions that they were going to try and tweak that approach this season. And we saw that. You've just mentioned Alan Brown. When we signed Alan Brown in the summer, I thought, brilliant. Experienced international midfielder, 400 games at this championship level, exactly the kind of player is going to be a great signing for Sunderland. And the way things have worked out, of course, not for the first time, we signed a player who's barely injured at his other club, and he comes to Sunderland and he's injured pretty much straight away and lost his place and then came back and then broke his leg against Coventry. So he's not featured very much, but he was an indication as to us breaking the model, if you like, to bring in an older player. We did the same on a loan basis, of course, with Chris Mepham. Luke Nyans now turned 30. Patrick Roberts is an experienced player. So if you look around the side, while we do have some very, very young players, I don't need to name them, we all know who the very young players are, there's more experience around them than there was this time last season. So I think they have tweaked that, and I think they have benefited from tweaking that, where before the policy was very much just to be playing young players. In answer to your question, do I think it's a good thing? I've nothing against it. I like the fact that there is a plan, because I do agree that some points in the past at Sunderland, if there's been a plan, I've not been aware of what it was. I've not been sure what they're trying to do. At least now I think I know what they're trying to do. How successful it'll be, well, time will tell. So far, as I say, 4th in the league, much better than we thought it would be at the start of the season. You've got to say, overall, it is working. Could it be working better? Would we like to win every game? Would we like to win every game by scoring lots more goals? Show me the football supporter on the planet who wouldn't like to do that. Yes, of course we would. Nobody would like to do that more than me, and go to the game and be 4-0 up with 20 minutes left and think, yes, I can relax and enjoy the game now, and not have my weekend ruined because we've conceded yet another late goal, which has been a blight on the season. It's cost us such a lot of points. But yes, they have got a plan. It's clearly stated what the plan is. I think this summer, especially if we don't go up, I would expect that we will see some of our best players that will be sold. They'll be in demand. The question then is, what do we do with the money? How well recruitment is key. Generally, the club's recruitment in the last year or two has been very good. Of course, there's been lots of people we've signed who've not worked out. That's always the case. But this summer's recruitment, we've got to hope maintains the standard of the last 2 or 3 years where they do get most of the signings right. No club are going to get every signing right. Sunderland generally, since Stuart Harvey's been there as sort of head of recruitment, generally, I think a high percentage of the players we've brought in have adapted to the club and adapted to British football in the case of those that have come from overseas very well. Wilson Isidore being a classic case. Normally you bring people in from overseas and say, he needs a year to acclimatise. Well, Wilson Isidore hasn't. He's got straight into it in 12 goals and 12 very good goals.
Yeah. And just thinking quickly about January, obviously, they weren't to know, injuries and things like this, but they did know how much Lefebvre had played. He hadn't played much football this season. Do you think even at the time that was a gamble, almost putting all our eggs in one basket with that transfer?
No, I don't. I thought it was clearly, like Isidore, it was clearly a player that Régis Bris knew. Clearly a player that he knew he could get the best out of. I was talking to Martin Hardy, a well-known journalist you might know of, in the press room ahead of the game at Leeds. And Martin was saying to me, I've really liked what I've seen of Isidore. And I said to him, well, so far, what I've seen so far, I haven't seen a better player in the division. And then that night at Leeds, I thought at 90 minutes, if Martin comes to see me at the full time, he'll say, what are you talking about, Rob? Because Lefebvre didn't really get into the game at Leeds. And then he got injured pretty quickly afterwards. But when we're talking about the players who are missing and injured at the moment and wanting back before the end of the season, Lefebvre is top of my list because what I saw from him, particularly at Middlesbrough, he was absolutely brilliant. And I don't see much of a gamble of putting the eggs in one basket because, yes, he's a very expensive player, but we've only got to buy him if we get promoted. I hope that we do buy him because that means we'll have been promoted and he would seem to me to be a player with the ability to succeed in the Premier League if we get there. Well, if we don't get the Premier League, my understanding is he will go back to Roma, and probably if we're not going to be in the Premier League next year, on the kind of wages I'm led to believe he's on, we wouldn't be in that ballpark to take him. But I thought the club often get accused of a lack of ambition, and I actually, rather than think we're putting all our eggs in one basket with him, I actually thought that was a statement of ambition from the club to try and bring him in, a player of that calibre in. Of course, it's just typical of Sunderland's misfortune that player then goes and gets injured and misses a substantial part of the latter part of the season. But hopefully he'll be fit and raring to go in the playoffs.
Yeah, it always happens to us, doesn't it? Always seems to be Sunderland, with these big signings. But like we say, we're in the international break. You've already mentioned Millwall at home next up, and we've already touched on that Coventry defeat, Rob. But we did a podcast straight after the game. I was absolutely livid with the performance. It's been a long time. I've kind of heaped praise on this team, and we have done today. And it's been a long time since I saw a performance where actually I thought we didn't get the basics right. We didn't win the tackles. We didn't win the headers. We didn't seem to be, Coventry seemed to be on a different level in terms of how much they wanted the game. And we can put that down to the club's position in the table, saying that, Coventry have got a lot more to play for. But how much should we worry about the fact that it wasn't just that we got beat? It was that we got beat with almost, that Coventry had more effort. They were first to the ball. They were winning those tackles. How much does that worry you?
It doesn't worry me in the slightest. It'll worry me if it happens again. If we're like that against Millwall, it'll happen. It'll worry me. But in a 46-game season, you tell me any game in a season where somebody doesn't have an off day. I mentioned earlier Luke and I thought was pretty decent. Everybody else I thought had an off day. I thought they were poor. I thought the passing was off radar. I don't think it was a lack of effort. I just think it was, a combined bad day at the office. I think if you look at Coventry's results, You'll find plenty of days when Coventry have had a bad day and they've had a bad day at the office as well, but a lot more than Sunderland. It was one game out of 46. Don't get me wrong, I was no more pleased than you at the final whistle at Coventry. If apart from Newcastle, if there's one team I like to beat, it's Coventry. That stems back to the 77 issue. And so for us to continue our dismal record against Coventry made me sick to the pits of my stomach. But I look at the bigger picture and I don't get worried about the fact that we had one bad game where we're rubbish after 46 games. As I say, we lost 3-0. That was our heaviest away defeat in over 3 years. Get the record books out and look at every other club. How many other clubs would have gone 3 years and not lost an away game, by a worse score over 3 years? It was a complete off day. It was a write-off. Forget it. It's a bit like if you're learning to drive and you have a bad driving lesson. Do you sweat on it and go to pieces and then be terrible in your next driving lesson? Or do you manage to draw a line under it and say, next time I'm going to be better? So when we come out against Millwall, we've got the added incentive of being up against Alex Neil, our former manager, not to mention one or two former players. Decent lads, by the way. I mentioned those former players. But we come out against Millwall and we are at it and we are better. If we are lacklustre again and our passing is rubbish again, then come back to me and I'll tell you I'm worried. But I'm not going to ever worry over one game. Just in the same way as if we go to a game and we're absolutely brilliant, I don't come away and think, we're going to be brilliant for the rest of the season. And football's football. And in a 46-game season, you've got to be consistent. You can win a cup by being good in a handful of games. You can't win a league or a promotion by being good in a handful of games. You've got to be good overall, but you can't be good all the time. That's just impossible. Nobody's ever had a season where they've won every game.
Yeah. And I see glass half full Gav, nodding his head and smiling while he was listening to that. I mean, we spoke after the game, Gav, and we were both fuming afterwards. If you kind of calmed down a bit, I mean, where were you at with that defeat at Coventry?
Yeah, I think Rob's right. Really, it's a performance where if it was a regular occurrence, you would be seriously in bother, and we're not. We're fourth in the table. We've said repeatedly, you don't get there by accident. You get there through consistency of performances and mainly results. So it would only be a concern if we were going to see a pattern after this point. And I don't believe we will. I do think we will probably lose another couple of games between now and the end of the season because we're going to be playing against teams who maybe have a little bit more than we have to play for at the minute. But that's by the by. I think we've just got to try and get back on track. It's one game at a time again. That's all it is. Millwall's not going to be easy. I remember Millwall away earlier in the season when we looked like we had victory, and I think was it Alexic or Mayenda went down, or maybe in the pair of them went down the other end with a great chance to score instead of taking it into the corner, and then we go down the other end and we concede and we drop 2 points. That was a tough game and it was a tough result to take. But step forward all this time, I think we've grown a lot as a team. I think the collective experience, Rob talked about experience before and getting experience around the younger lads. Whilst the collective youth of this group is one thing, there's a lot of experience there. A lot of these lads went through a playoff winning campaign 3 seasons ago. A lot of them went through the disappointment of losing to Luton over 2 legs. And yes, they might be young, but you can't buy that experience. It doesn't matter if you're in your 30s or not. If that's recent experience in a Sunderland shirt that they've all got. So I'm still pretty confident about the rest of the season. I think we've just got to try and develop some consistency in a time when it's going to be tough. But I think Lefebvre coming back, that he was mentioned before, I think Lefebvre coming back will give us a lot. And I know me and you talked about this, Chris, about, I think I said I felt we missed him against Coventry, somebody like that. And I think going forward, it's just that confidence that a player like that, we all know what he can do. The rest of the lads know what he can do. They'll all gain confidence just from knowing that they've got Enzo Lefebvre back to play with. And Absolutely. That's going to make a massive difference, I think. So I'm actually looking really optimistically at the rest of the season. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I think if we can just, particularly that last 3 or 4 games, if we can go into the playoffs in some decent form, I fancy us to beat any of the other teams in there. Over 2 legs and at Wembley, I fancy us to beat any of them. But it's about finding the consistency that we had probably 2 or 3 months ago there. I think if we can do that, then we've got a very good chance.
Yeah, well, speaking of getting ahead of ourselves, Nick Barnes has said he's got his London hotel already booked for the potential playoff final. Rob, are you that organised?
Booked mine about a month ago.
Well, there you go then. You've heard it here first. Sunderland are going to be at Wembley.
Mind you, it is cancelable till 24 hours later, but, I thought it might be cheaper to book in a month ago than it might be nearer the time.
You spoilt the magic there, Rob. I thought you were going all in. I thought that was it.
To be honest, when I booked it a month ago, I was hoping I wasn't going to use it because I was still thinking until we got beat at home, I was still thinking we were likely to finish in the top two. I was thinking at that time I booked it, I thought I'm going to cancel it because we're not going to be in the playoffs at all. We're going to be top two. But now I'm thinking, well, I'm hoping I'm going to need it because I'm hoping we're going to get to the final and not bow out at the semi-final stage.
Yeah, well, we'll see how it all plays out, but that just leaves me to say thank you very much for your time, Rob. Much appreciated.
Pleasure to speak to you, and all the best to everyone, and to you two lads in particular.
Brilliant. It's been an absolute pleasure as always,
Cheers,
and hopefully we'll catch up for maybe a playoff special or something like that. Fingers crossed.
So. Celebratory one after we've won.
Good stuff. And cheers as always, Gav. I'm sure you've got another pod or two planned in the near future, mate.
Anytime, mate. You know me. Always here to talk Sunderland.
Good stuff. And thanks again for everyone for listening. We hope you've enjoyed what we're doing so far, like the recent interviews and news roundups, as well as all the usual pods. We've got loads of stuff planned, so please subscribe or hit the like button and all of that jazz, because, I don't know what the buttons are, but I'm sure it all helps. And obviously keep checking out the Roker Report website for all the bits and pieces we have on there. And we'll have all the build-up to the Millwall game, of course, as well. But from us, it's bye for now.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.